In your book, you start, and I think we could start as well, with what we don't understand about China. I mean, even just today, Bloomberg had a report, broke news that the Chinese apparently have been planting tiny little chips in computer motherboards that end up in computers that U.S. companies rely upon, and it gives them access into us. Do we appreciate exactly how sophisticated the Chinese are, how powerful they are?
I think there's a kind of a great awakening happening across the U.S. as people are, it's sort of dawning on them that China is not just a rising power. China has risen. China is now seriously rivaling the U.S. in virtually every domain. I mean, most times when I think even Bloomberg probably still reports China, the U.S. has the largest economy in the world, China the second. But if you look at this in terms of the yardstick that both the CIA and the IMF think is the best yardstick for comparing national economies, purchasing power parity, China surpassed the U.S. in 2014. It's a quarter bigger than the U.S. today in terms of GDP. And it'll be half again larger than we are on the current trend lines by 2024. So you look at that and you just say, yikes, all this happened in a generation which most of it haven't been looking.
And without trying to be too confrontational, part of the reason why purchasing power parity is so important, as you explain in your book, is that's what determines how much military hardware you can buy as a practical matter. And so it really does come back potentially to military issues.
Well, the yardstick, basically, just as you say, is how much stuff I can buy. So how much does it cost me for a drone? How much does it cost me for a base? How much does it cost me for an airplane? How much does it cost me for a missile? How much does it cost me for a soldier? And if you put it in these terms, the Chinese economy today is as big, indeed CAA says, slightly bigger than the U.S. And the consequence of that is tectonic. You see it everywhere. You see it all across the business spectrum, only little by little, awaking to. And we'll see it, as we're already seeing it, all across the military competition, and especially in the areas most closest to China, like the South China Sea and the event that happened 2 days ago when two ships almost collided.
Yeah, and there are reports, at least from some news sources, that maybe the Navy, our U.S. Navy, is about to have big operations in the South China Sea. So you were a student particularly of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when two great powers almost came to war, fighting war. Take the present situation that we have right now with, as you say, some geopolitical conflict around the South China Sea, as well as clear economic and trade conflict, even this chip story from today with the hacking with the chip. Put that together. If you were advising the two countries, advise them on how to avoid really having this escalate further and perhaps even out of control. Advise the United States, what's the best response that Washington, that President Trump could make to this report about the chip?
Well, let me put it in a bigger perspective for a second. I think the first proposition is to recognize that because of structural conditions that are the consequence of a rising China that is actually threatening to displace a ruling U.S., that because of this thucidity and dynamic, the future will be extremely dangerous. Not just dangerous, extremely dangerous. And in fact, that in most of these competitions, the way the parties get to war, that neither of them wanted. So most of the stories of the 12 of the 16 cases that end the war, it's not a war initiated by the rising power or by the ruling power. Instead, what happens is a third party's provocation or accident leads to one or the other feeling that it's necessary to react. That produces a spiral of interactions that ends in a war nobody wanted. Here we are just, in November, we'll stop on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour to remember the final day of a war that was so devastating, historians had to create a whole new category, World War. So the guns of World War I fell silent on the 11th of November in 1918, but 25 million people were dead. So the first thing is to recognize the danger. Secondly, if you go back to your Cuban Missile Crisis example, what Kennedy learned from that, and Khrushchev learned, and what happened in the U.S. relationship thereafter, was that you've got to constrain some areas of the competition, particularly ones where third parties or accidents might drag us where we don't want to go, while you compete in other areas. So Kennedy ultimately came to a view that what he called that we need to have a world safe for diversity, in which he was perfectly prepared to have our free system compete with a Soviet empire that was basically a terrorist or gulag system that controlled people. And in the end, that worked out well.
So if, from your really extraordinary experience and studying, take a read on the trade conflict. As President Trump has really clearly decided he wants to have a tussle, or worse, with China over trade. Is that a positive development or a negative? Because I could say it's positive because it's a way of combating without going to literal war. You have a virtual war in trade. Or does it heighten tensions?
Well, and the answer, you answered it, the answer is both. So if one believes that the last 25 years, or the period since the last 20 years since China entered the WTO, that China has basically violated every rule that it could get away with, and that it has taken advantage of stealing intellectual property, forcing the sharing of technologies, doing things like the chip that you're just talking about, that in everywhere, in every arena, China has been serious about trying to make China great again. That's what Xi Jinping says is his objective. In that situation, the question of whether the rules of this economic relationship and trade relationship are fair, or whether they need to be fundamentally adjusted, is a fair question. And President Trump has concluded they need to be fundamentally adjusted. Whether the way that he's trying to go about that at this point, to what end, is less clear.
I suppose the ultimate question, Professor, is it a zero-sum game? Can China become great again without diminishing the greatness of the United States?
That's, I think you got the question that should rivet us all to think about what kind of world can we imagine in which China and the U.S. can live together, in which China can realize its reasonable ambitions and expectations, and in which the U.S. can be the U.S. On the tradition, or historically, that becomes too difficult for the two parties. So for Americans to imagine that a China that would be bigger economically than we are, and maybe even bigger militarily than we are, will be part of a world we can live in. Very hard for Americans to imagine. And similarly, for China to imagine that it should just take its place as a responsible stakeholder in an American-dominated order seems highly unreasonable. So this is a period when we need extreme imagination. So I mean, my kind of conclusion, and this is the issue I've been passionately pursuing for the 15 months since the book was published, is how to escape Thucydides' trap. My conclusion is we're going to have a lot more imagination than we've seen demonstrated so far by statescraft in either country. And I don't take from that any reason for pessimism. I think if I go back and ask, what did Americans do in the period after World War II in inventing what became the Cold War strategy by 1950? And they did 6 impossible things that were almost inconceivable to people at the time. But in any case, they did. So I don't see why we couldn't have such a stretch of imagination again. And that's, I think, what we need.